The parking garage on 5th and Clement smelled like rain and motor oil, the kind of smell that clings to everything in November. Everett Marsh had $42 in his checking account. He knew the exact number because he'd checked it 3 times that morning on his phone while sitting in the school parking lot after dropping Nolan off, watching his son wave goodbye through the chain-link fence without looking back, the way 8-year-olds do when they've already moved on to the next thing, already thinking about recess and juice boxes, completely unaware that their father was sitting in a 10-year-old Chevy, wondering how to make $42 last until Friday. He had a meeting in 20 minutes, the most important meeting of his career. Everett was a structural engineer, not the kind who designed glass towers in downtown magazines. The kind who spent 15 years reinforcing bridges in forgotten counties, calculating load-bearing tolerances for municipal buildings that would never win awards but would stand for 100 years. He was good at it. He knew he was good at it. And 2 months ago, Halcott Infrastructure Group had opened a public bid for the restoration of the Meridian River Bridge, a $14 million contract, the kind that came around. The kind that came around once every decade, and Everett had spent every night after Nolan went to sleep putting together the most complete proposal he'd ever written. He'd taken unpaid leave from his current job to do it. He'd cashed out a small investment account his wife had set up before she died. He had $42. The parking garage charged $8 for the first hour. He fed the machine 6 crumpled bills and the rest in quarters, fingers clumsy from the cold, and walked toward the elevator without looking at how much was left. That was when he heard her. Not loud, not crying exactly. More like the sound a person makes when they're trying very hard not to make any sound at all. A short, controlled exhale through the nose. The kind that means something has just gone badly wrong and there are people watching. She was standing at the pay station on the other side of the garage entrance. Dark coat, dark hair pulled back, a tote bag over one shoulder and a phone pressed to her ear. The machine in front of her had her card. It kept giving it back. She kept trying. The phone call wasn't going anywhere either. Everett could tell from the way her jaw moved, tight and deliberate, the body language of someone leaving a voicemail and already knowing no one would pick up. He stood there for a second. He was going to be late. He had $36. He walked over. "Hey," he said. "How much is it?" She pulled the card out of the slot and turned to look at him. She had one of those faces that default to composed, the kind of person who probably rarely lets strangers see them rattled. But she was rattled now, just barely around the eyes. $7.50, she said. "My card's being declined. I don't know why it was fine this morning." "It happens," Everett said and fed the machine a 10. "Don't worry about it." She stared at him. "I can't let you." "You'll be late," he said. "I'll be late. It's 7:50. He pressed the green button. The ticket printed. He handed it to her. She took it slowly, like she wasn't quite sure what had just happened. "I'll pay you back. If you give me your—" "It's fine," he said, and he meant it, and he was already walking toward the elevator because he genuinely did not have time to stand there and be thanked. He didn't get her name. He didn't think about her again until the meeting was already ruined. The Halcott boardroom was on the 14th floor of a building that had better windows than his entire apartment. 8 people sat around a glass table. Everett had been to enough of these to know, within the first 2 minutes, how they would go. And within the first 2 minutes of the one, he knew. There was a man at the far end of the table named Hargrove, late 50s, silver cufflinks, the energy of someone who had already decided the outcome before the first slide. He asked good questions, sharp ones, the kind designed not to get answers but to expose gaps. He asked about Everett's bonding capacity. He asked about the subcontractor relationships. He asked, in a tone that was almost gentle, why Everett's firm had no projects above $3 million in the past 4 years. Everett answered every question, honestly, directly, without hedging. He had the answers because he'd spent 2 months making sure he had the answers. It didn't matter. He could feel it the way you feel weather changing. Some atmospheric shift in the room that meant the decision was already made, had been made before he walked in, and this meeting was a formality being extended to him as a courtesy. Someone else was getting the contract, someone with a bigger name, a longer track record, a firm with 40 employees instead of 3. He packed up his laptop at the end of a 90-minute presentation and shook hands with people who wouldn't meet his eyes. And he rode the elevator back down to the lobby. and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and stared at the street. He thought about Nolan. He thought about what he was going to tell Nolan, who didn't know about the proposal or the unpaid leave or the investment account. Because Nolan was 8 years old, and the only thing he knew was that Daddy had been working really hard on something important, and that soon things were going to be better. That was what Everett had said on a night 3 weeks ago when Nolan had asked why they hadn't gone anywhere for fall break like his friend Carter had. Soon things are going to be better. He'd believed it when he said it. He stood on the sidewalk for another minute. Then he got his car. He drove to pick up Nolan. On the way his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He almost didn't answer. "Is this Everett Marsh?" A woman's voice. Professional, precise but not cold. "Yes, this is Laurel Voss. I'm the Director of Infrastructure Partnerships at Halcott." A pause. "We met briefly in the garage this morning. You paid my parking." He had no idea what to say to that. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I want to ask you something and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "Okay, your proposal came to me before the meeting. I read it 2 nights ago. I thought it was the strongest technical submission we received." Another pause, shorter this time. "What happened in that room today had nothing to do with your work. There are internal considerations I'm not going to explain over the phone, but I want to know, and I'm asking you directly if you'd be willing to come back in. Not to the same room, to a different conversation." Everett was stopped at a red light. He stared at it until it turned green and didn't move. The car behind him honked. He pulled forward. "Mr. Marsh?" "Yes," he said. "I'm willing." Laurel Voss had been Director of Infrastructure Partnerships at Halcott for 3 years, and she had been passed over for that position twice before finally getting it on the 3rd try. She knew what it looked like when someone was being evaluated fairly and when they weren't. She'd been on the wrong side of that line enough times to recognize it from across a boardroom. She hadn't planned to say anything. That was the truth she kept coming back to, as she sat in her office after the call, looking at the proposal on her desk. She had not planned to say anything. She'd been in that industry long enough to know which fights to pick, and a board decision with Hargrove behind it was not a fight you picked on a Tuesday in November based on a feeling. But then she'd pulled up the license plate number she'd photographed in the garage. A habit, she kept a record of small things, and cross-referenced it against the proposal signatures she'd been reviewing all week. And there it was, E. Marsh, the man who'd paid her parking without asking for anything. She'd gone back through his proposal that night, really gone through it. Not the executive summary, not the budget table, but the engineering analysis, the risk mitigation framework, the site-specific load calculations that most firms copy-paste from previous projects, but that Marsh had done fresh, from scratch. For this bridge specifically, it was good work. It was genuinely, quietly, rigorously good work. And she knew, because she'd been in this job long enough to know, that good work wasn't always enough. But sometimes, if you had the right position and the right moment, you could make it enough. You had to choose when to use that. You couldn't use it every time, but you could use it now. She called him. She still wasn't entirely sure why. Not just the parking, not just the proposal. There was something in the way he'd handed her the ticket and turned away that had stayed with her, the complete absence of performance. He hadn't waited to see how she reacted. He hadn't lingered. He'd just done it and moved on like it was nothing, like 750 was nothing, and she had later done the math and realized that for a man in his situation, she'd done enough research to know roughly what his situation was. 750 was probably not nothing. That mattered to her. She wasn't sure she could explain why it mattered. It just did. They met 4 days later, not at Halcott's main office. At a smaller conference room in a building across the street that Laurel's team used for early-stage partner discussions. She'd brought 2 colleagues, people she trusted, people outside Hargrove's direct orbit. Everett came with his laptop and a cardboard tube of drawings and no one else. They spent 2 hours going through the proposal section by section. Not the performance, a real conversation, the kind where people disagree and ask why and push back and actually listen to the answers. By the end of it, one of Laurel's colleagues, a man named Pierce who had been in infrastructure for 25 years and didn't give compliments, had leaned back in his chair and said, "This is the most site-specific risk analysis I've seen on a municipal bridge project in a long time." Everett had looked at the table when he said it. Laurel had noticed that. She'd noticed a lot of things in that 2 hours. The way Everett answered every question without qualifying it first. The way he said, "I don't know," when he didn't know something, and "I'd need to verify that," when he wasn't certain, instead of bluffing forward the way a lot of engineers did when they were trying to close a deal. The way he'd brought drawings, physical drawings, rolled in a cardboard tube, because he'd thought they'd be easier to follow than a screen. She'd noticed, too, that he checked his phone once and then turned it face down on the table and didn't look at it again. She'd seen the lock screen for half a second. A kid, small, grinning, missing a front tooth. She didn't say anything about it. After Pierce and her other colleague left, she and Everett sat at the table alone for a moment. "There are things I can't promise you," she said. "The board vote has already happened. I can't undo that. I know. What I can do is bring your proposal to a subcommittee review that's separate from Hargrove's project. There's a secondary contract, Phase 2 of the Meridian restoration. Smaller scope, lower profile. It wasn't part of the original bid. We've been looking for the right firm." Everett was quiet for a moment. "How much smaller?" "About a third of the Phase 1 value." He nodded slowly, not with excitement, with something more like the considered nod of someone doing real math in real time, calculating, rebalancing, accepting. "That works," he said. She believed him. What Everett didn't know, as he drove back across the river that afternoon, with the windows down, despite the cold, was that Laurel had spent part of the previous week dealing with something that had nothing to do with bridge proposals or boardrooms. Her sister had called from Portland on a Thursday night to tell her that their father was being moved into assisted living. There had been an incident. Their father had left the gas on again, the second time in 2 months. The facility was good. The decision was right. Laurel knew all of this. She also lay awake until 2 in the morning that night, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, listening to the city outside, feeling the particular loneliness of being the person who keeps everything organized while the things that matter most continue to slip anyway. She'd been doing this job for 3 years. Before that, 7 years at a consulting firm. Before that, graduate school. Before that, a marriage that had lasted 4 years and ended quietly and without drama, which somehow made it worse. She was 41 years old, and she was good at her job, and her apartment was clean, and she owned a good coat, and most days that felt like enough. Some days it didn't. She didn't tell people that. She was extremely good at not telling people that. 3 weeks later, Everett's firm was formally awarded the Phase 2 contract. He got the call on a Wednesday afternoon, standing in his kitchen, and he sat down on the floor, with his back against the cabinet, and pressed his palm flat against the linoleum and breathed. Nolan came in 20 minutes later, dropped his backpack by the door, said, "Dad, why are you on the floor?" And Everett said, "I got the job, bud." And Nolan said, "The bridge job?" And Everett said, "Yeah." And Nolan said, "Cool," and went to get a juice box from the fridge, stepping over Everett's legs on the way. Everett laughed. He hadn't laughed that way in a while, the kind that comes from somewhere low and uncomplicated. He texted Laurel. "Contract confirmed. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you." She replied 3 hours later, "You did the work, we just had the right conversation." He stared at that text for a minute. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went to make dinner. There were things that happened after that. Gradually, in the careful way things happen between two people who are both very accustomed to being careful. He sent her a short email 2 weeks after the contract was signed, asking a technical question about the Phase 1 specs that she didn't actually need to answer. He could have gotten it from the public documents, but which gave him a reason to write to her. She answered it thoroughly. She answered it the same day. She ran into him in the parking garage again. Not the same one, a different one, near the city permit office, where they both had separate meetings on the same Thursday afternoon. They stood by the elevator and talked for 11 minutes about nothing in particular. The permit process, a coffee shop nearby, whether the city's new bike lane plan was going to create problems for the river access road. Neither of them mentioned the first parking garage. It sat there between them like a thing they'd both decided to leave alone for now. He asked if she wanted to get coffee. She said she had another meeting. He said of course. She got in the elevator. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The following week she emailed him. Not about the project. She said there was a public infrastructure talk at the university on Friday evening that might be relevant to the Phase 2 timeline, and she thought he might find it useful. He went. She went. They sat next to each other. They got dinner after, at a Vietnamese place 2 blocks from the university that neither of them had been to before. They talked for 2 hours. About work at first, then about other things. Her father's situation, the facility in Portland, the strange grief of watching a parent become someone unfamiliar. About Nolan's mother, the way Everett talked about her, without performance, without the polished version people often gave strangers, just the plain true shape of it. She had been sick for 2 years. She had been brave. She had made him promise not to use the good china only on Sundays, and he'd started using it every night since she died. Laurel didn't say anything for a moment after that. "That's a good promise to keep," she said. He nodded. She knew me pretty well. What Hargrove had done, it turned out, was something that had been done before and would have stayed buried if a junior analyst on his team hadn't made a careless mistake in an internal memo 6 weeks into the Phase 1 construction. The memo referenced a prior arrangement, a subcontractor affiliation that Hargrove admits Hargrove had not disclosed when the board did on the original contract. A financial connection that under Halcott's ethics policy should have disqualified him from involvement in the selection process. Laurel didn't bring this to the board. She brought it to the legal and compliance team, quietly, with documentation. What happened after was not dramatic. There was no public confrontation. There was no shouting match in a conference room. Hargrove resigned in January, citing personal reasons, and the board appointed a transitional committee to review the Phase 1 award. The review would take months. The outcome was not certain. What was certain was that the Phase 2 contract stood. It had gone through a separate process, a clean one, and Everett's firm had earned it on the merits, and no one at Halcott had any inclination to revisit it. Pierce said to Laurel in passing, one morning, "Good call on Marsh." "He earned it," she said. "Still a good call," Pierce said. In February there was an ice storm. Everett called Laurel on a Saturday afternoon to ask whether the Phase 2 site inspection could be pushed back because the access road to the river was closed. She said yes, obviously she'd already sent an email. He said he hadn't seen it yet. She said he should check his email more. He said he was a field engineer, not an office person. She said that was not her problem. He asked if she'd eaten. She hadn't. She'd been inside all day, and the ice storm had knocked her grocery delivery sideways, and she had eggs and half a block of cheese and a strong opinion that this was fine. "I could bring something," he said. "Nolan's at his grandmother's. I was going to drive past your neighborhood anyway. You don't know where my neighborhood is. You mentioned the street name once, near the botanical garden." She paused. "You remembered that." "I remember things that are useful," he said. There was a long pause. "There's a Thai place on Mercer that delivers during ice storms," she said. "I don't know why. I've never questioned it." "What do you want?" she told him. He ordered it. He drove over in the ice storm, which was inadvisable. And she didn't say that, and he brought the food and they ate at her kitchen table, and talked for 4 hours, and he drove home at midnight. Nothing happened. And then, the next time they met, for a site review, professional, scheduled, something had shifted slightly, the way the air shifts after a front passes through. Both of them felt it. Neither of them named it yet. That was all right. They were both people who understood that some structures take time, that the most important ones, the ones that are meant to hold weight for a long time, aren't built in a single pour, they're built in stages. Each one cured and tested before the next begins. Nolan met her in March, at a lunch that was not presented as anything official. Just his dad's colleague, just someone from the bridge project, just lunch. Nolan was not fooled. He was 8 years old and extremely observant, a quality he had gotten from his mother, and he spent approximately 4 minutes evaluating Laurel, with the unself-conscious directness of a child who has decided that social niceties are optional. He asked her if she'd ever been on a bridge that fell down. She said no. He said that was good because that would be scary. She agreed it would be. He asked if she liked dogs. She said she liked them but her building didn't allow them. He considered this and said that was a bad building. She said she agreed. He asked what her favorite dinosaur was. Ankylosaurus, she said, without hesitating. Nolan pointed at her with his fork. Good answer. Everett, across the table, was very carefully not smiling. On the drive home, Nolan looked out the window for a while and then said, "She's nice." Just that. Factual, unprompted, the way he delivered most of his verdicts. Everett said, "Yeah, she is." Nolan went back to looking out the window. That was enough. The Meridian Bridge's Phase 2 section opened to pedestrian traffic the following October. Ahead of schedule, under budget, a fact that the city briefly noted in a press release that almost no one read. Everett was there for the opening, standing on the walkway in the October light, watching people cross. Laurel was there too. She stood next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. Below, the river moved the way rivers do, indifferent to schedules and press releases, indifferent to contracts and board votes, indifferent to everything except the long, patient work of getting from one place to another. Not bad, Laurel said, looking at the span. It'll hold, Everett said. He meant the bridge. He was also, in some quieter part of himself, talking about something else entirely. She knew that. She let it stand. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. Some structures are tested not by a single event but by time, by ordinary weight, by the 10,000 unremarkable crossings that prove, day after day, that what was built right. 7:50 in a parking garage on a November morning. That was where it started. Everything else was just the work.